Good afternoon. Welcome to New Orleans. Well, it's an honor to be speaking once again at the Republican Leadership Conference here in my home state of Louisiana. I will tell you, things have changed since I was first elected to office here 20 years ago. Back then, being a Republican in this part of the world was kind of a lonely experience. It was kind of like being clean-shaven at a Duck Dynasty convention. But thanks to many of you that are here today, beard or no beard, that has changed for the better, and now we have plenty of company, and we have a state that is dominated by good conservative leadership. Now, I have a difficult task addressing you today. It's not that I have a difficult proposition to defend. No, it's just difficult to believe that this proposition would ever need defending in the United States of America. But it boils down to this: religious freedom is essential to we who are Americans. But we can no longer assume that all our fellow Americans share that conviction. Therefore, we must now wage the fight of our lives to keep this essential freedom. Now, the fight, in fact, is well underway. In the past, the struggle has been subtle and indirect, but today it is blatant and it is brutal. The subtlety has been there in the proclamations issuing from academic institutions and now from the Obama administration, that they tried to cast the freedom of religion as merely the freedom of worship. Now, this idea isn't completely new. After all, the freedom of worship was one of the four freedoms that Franklin D. Roosevelt listed in his famous 1941 State of the Union address to Congress. And some of you may remember this. It became a subject of Norman Rockwell's celebrated paintings illustrating that speech. Rockwell depicted freedom of worship by showing an array of faces of different ages, of different ethnic backgrounds and faiths, all bowed in attitudes of prayer. And not long after that speech, when the United States formally entered World War II, that famed illustration graced posters urging Americans to finance the war effort. You might remember those posters. "Save freedom of worship," the poster read, "each according to the dictates of his own conscience, buy war bonds." But what our grandparents' generation meant as a theme to push outward against the forces of totalitarianism and imperialism has become, in the hands of an aggressive secular state, a drive to push people of faith out of the public square. It is no longer a call to genuine faith, but an attempt to confine our religious liberty within the walls of our churches and our meeting halls. This freedom of worship under this administration is a sentence to solitary confinement, not freedom of religion, but freedom from religion. How do we know this? Well, the examples are now too numerous to count, and they all point in the same parallel direction. Let me begin with one of the most obvious. In just a few weeks, the Supreme Court of the United States will hand down one of the most significant religious freedom cases in modern times, in the Hobby Lobby and Conestoga Wood specialty cases. Now, these cases are not about contraception or even about drugs or devices that can end a life. These cases represent a clash over conscience that implicates the liberty of every American, all of us here today, and generations yet unborn. In a sex-saturated culture where contraceptives are ubiquitous, the federal government has sought to impose its will on businesses that have made a corporate commitment to a different worldview on human life. The imposition is completely and totally unnecessary. Our government could simply give a free Medicaid card to every person in America if they wish to. There's other options that they could pursue, but instead it has chosen a method that, as Justice Kennedy pointed out in asking questions during the oral argument, could force every business and nonprofit in the country, with the exception of houses of worship, to pay for elective abortions for their workers. Talk about absolute power corrupting absolutely. Given the availability of alternatives, it isn't too much to say that the point of the preventive services mandate is not to promote health, but to demonstrate the government's brute power over conscience. To bring us to what This brings us to what writer Maggie Gallagher is rightly calling the new McCarthyism. This McCarthyism would force every corporate leader, university official, public contractor, or media figure to answer a question. Are you now, or have you ever been involved in the effort to preserve marriage as the union of a man and a woman? No, I'll go further than that. This new McCarthyism demands, do you now think, or have you ever thought that marriage should remain the union of a man and a woman? Answer it incorrectly, and watch your career be taken from you and your reputation smeared on 1,000 websites. Examples of this continue to pile up like scandals in the Obama administration. And I don't have all afternoon to go through them. Last month, a federal district judge dismissed a lawsuit filed by Angela McCaskill, who suffered job retaliation at Gallaudet University for merely signing a petition allowing a citizen vote on Maryland's law creating same-sex marriage. McCaskill has never said how she would have voted on the ballot measure, but you know what? That should not matter in a free society. She was confronted by university administrators who derided her Christian beliefs, and she was put on paid leave for exercising her most basic constitutional rights. Earlier this year, Brendan Eich, the computer genius who created JavaScript, was hounded out of his new position as CEO of Mozilla, the popular web browser company. Eich was plucked out, put in the stocks, and sent packing because he had the nerve to support, along with the majority of his fellow Californians, Prop 8, which rescued California's definition of marriage from judicial tyranny. A Huffington Post writer recently labeled Eich, quote, a dangerous villain more despicable than Los Angeles Clippers owner Donald Sterling. Finally, at the Department of Defense, our military men and women are finding that there is no more dangerous exercise than being willing to express religious convictions in public. In March, U.S. Air Force Academy officials forced the erasure of a whiteboard belonging to a cadet who had recorded on it a verse, Galatians 2:20, I have been crucified with Christ, therefore I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Mikey Weinstein, the relentless founder of the grossly misnamed Military Religious Freedom Foundation, said that the erasure was the just result of dozens of complaints his group had received from other cadets and faculty at the academy. Then he labeled the Air Force Academy a virulently hyper-fundamentalist Christian institution. The cadets' offense, Weinstein said, was to put the verse out in the hallway and not keep it in his room out of the sight of others. This, my friends, is the way this new freedom of worship will be allowed to operate. Out of sight, out of mind, out of influence on public policy and public affairs. Why? Because it is an enemy of the all-encompassing secular state. Now, this is just one problem with this vision of life. It is not the one we inherited as Americans, and it is most definitely not freedom. At the close of his For Freedom speech, calling on the nation to rally to the defense of democracy against foreign dictators whose only religion, by the way, was the state, Roosevelt said, quote, the nation has placed its destiny in the hands and heads and hearts of its millions of free men and women and its faith in freedom under the guidance of God, end quote. That statement was in keeping with an unbroken line of understanding, tracing back to our nation's founding era when the American experiment in liberty began. To Lincoln, Madison, Jefferson, Jay, and Washington, religious liberty was never merely a procedural right, an island of private belief meant to be circumscribed and isolated from our public duties. The conviction that our unalienable rights, which give form and definition to our constitutional government, come directly from God who made us, was made explicit where it mattered most, in the Declaration of Independence. The founders The founders did not believe our form of government could long endure absent the moral compass set by religious conviction. As John Adams wrote in October of 1798 to the officers of the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Division of the Massachusetts Militia, quote, "Our Constitution is made for a moral and a religious people. It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other," end quotes. By invoking the need for protection and restoring religious freedom, let me be clear, I am not signaling today a retreat to some higher ground after defeat in what the media may call the culture wars. I'm not describing a scheme of redoubts where the flame of religious liberty is sheltered from the harsh winds of opinion and legislation. I'm calling on all of us here today, all of us within the Republican and conservative movements, to recognize and affirm that there will be no liberty without religious liberty. There will be no constitutional government. There will be no constitutional government unless we remain proudly a moral and a religious people. In advancing this view, we must not be arrogant, but we must refuse to be intimidated. We must not shrink back, nor shall we grow silent, but we must be willing to stand tall in the public square. We must be willing to champion our convictions wherever we work, and no matter who may attack us or oppose us, we must be not afraid. By all means, let us worship. And let us offer prayers with our families in our homes, in our private associations, affirming God as the author of our rights. But just as we would never limit the freedom to bear arms to an armory or a parade ground, we must never accept the idea that religious freedom must be restrained inside a building and kept from the eyes of others lest they be troubled by its messages. The free exercise of religion resides in the First Amendment, alongside the freedom of speech, the freedom to peaceably assemble, the freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances, for the simple reason that it ranks among our nation's first principles. In its place, some would erect a disordered liberty that puts the whole of our enterprise in freedom at risk. The great analyst of American democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, quoted John Winthrop on this point. Winthrop said, quote, "There is a liberty of a corrupt nature, which is affected by both men and beasts to do what they list. And this liberty is inconsistent with authority, impatient of all restraint. By this liberty we are all made inferior. 'Tis the grand enemy of truth and peace, and all the ordinances of God are bent against it. But there is a civil, a moral, a federal liberty, which is the proper end and object of authority. It is a liberty for that which, only which, is just and good, and for this liberty you are to stand with the hazard of your very lives, and whatsoever crosses it is not authority, but a distemper thereof," end quote. Let me close by putting our challenge in some perspective. Good men and women are suffering for the exercise of their God-given rights, incurring job losses, restrictions on their freedoms, and vicious personal attacks. But my friends, we still have the liberty to fight for our liberty, and we must use it. Others, however, are not so fortunate. Today, as we sit in this beautiful ballroom, the wife of an American citizen, Miriam Ibrahim, languishes in a Khartoum, Sudan jail cell with her 20-month-old son and almost 1-week-old daughter, where she has been shackled awaiting execution for 4 months. Her crime? She has allegedly committed both apostasy and adultery by virtue of being a Muslim by birth and marrying a Christian man. The judge who sentenced her to death under his interpretation of Sharia law has generously ruled that she would not be executed until her baby was born. The clock is now ticking, and President Obama is still sitting. There was a day when it meant something to have the title of an American citizen. But today, to be American, you might be left behind in Benghazi. You might be left to rot in an Iranian cell as an American pastor, Pastor Saeed, or 2 babies in a Khartoum jail. Mr. President, it's time to stand up for Americans. This is a price that none of us has yet to face for the exercise of our religious freedom. But we must recognize that there is a correlation between the increase in religious persecution abroad and the growing intolerance toward religion here at home at the hands of our own government. We must pray and we must work for the freedom of the world's Miriams. But to do so, we must rededicate ourselves to a vision of religious liberty that affirms our natural rights here at home. As President Ronald Reagan warned 30 years ago this summer, quote, "Without God, democracy will not and cannot long endure." If we ever forget that we are one nation under God, then we will be a nation gone under. My friends, we must reclaim America's fundamental character and resolve to protect the fount of our freedom while there is still time. This is the great challenge of our day. Thank you, and may God bless you.